They called her grandma behind her back. Dr. Preston Sterling, with his jawline carved from arrogance and the Harvard degree he wore like a crown, actually placed a $500 bet that Sarah Miller wouldn't last a month at Harborview Medical Center. The younger nurses, like Brittany Moore, would giggle into their hands when he said it, their laughter a nervous currency they paid to stay in his good graces. Sarah Miller heard them. She was not deaf, merely quiet. At 48, with streaks of silver in the tight, unfashionable bun at the nape of her neck and the pair of reading glasses perched on her nose, she knew she looked more like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn than a trauma nurse. Her scrubs, a size too large, hung on her small 5'3" frame, hiding the wiry strength forged in places these young doctors and nurses only saw in movies. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the residents mad. They saw slowness. She saw precision. They saw hesitation. She saw a mind triple-checking dosages, confirming allergies, and reviewing contraindications. Most of all, they saw the faint, rhythmic tremor in her hands. "Nerves, probably," Sterling had declared loudly in the break room one afternoon, polishing his Rolex with the sleeve of his pristine white coat. "Some people just aren't cut out for the pressure. We can't have our patients at risk because Grandma's got the shakes." Sarah was 3 weeks into her new position at the prestigious downtown Seattle hospital. After 2 decades of a life she no longer spoke of, she had wanted this. The quiet anonymity, the simple, noble act of healing without the accompanying roar of helicopter rotors or the percussive thump of mortars. She wanted to collect a paycheck, protect her pension, and live out her days in the gentle, grey drizzle of the Pacific Northwest, honoring a promise made to her late husband under a sky choked with sand and smoke. Her tremor was not from nerves. It was a souvenir, a ghost memory etched into her nerve endings from 6 straight hours of lying in the dust of a Kandahar province ditch, her hands clamped like a vice on a young ranger's shredded femoral artery. She had refused evacuation for herself, her own shoulder bleeding from shrapnel, until the boy on the ground was stable enough to fly. The nerve damage was permanent. Her hands had not been truly still since. "Miller!" Sterling's voice cut through the controlled chaos of the emergency department on the Tuesday night. "The central supply closet on this floor is a disaster. I can't find a single 18-gauge catheter. I want you to go in there, pull everything out, check expiration dates, and reorganize it. Alphabetically." A half-dozen nurses and 2 junior residents froze. It was a janitor's task, a punishment, a public humiliation designed to put the old nurse in her place. Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with arms like a dock worker and a face that had seen every horror a city hospital could offer, narrowed her eyes. Brenda didn't like Sterling, but she hadn't made up her mind about Sarah either. The woman was too quiet, too methodical. She moved like she was conserving energy for a fight that was never coming. Sarah simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Dr. Sterling." She turned and walked toward the supply closet, her steps measured and even. The tremor in her hands was a little more pronounced now, a betrayal of the calm she projected. As the closet door swung shut behind her, Sterling smirked at Brittany Moore, who was studiously avoiding Sarah's gaze. "See? Protocol and hierarchy. It's how we maintain excellence. Some people need to be reminded of their place in the food chain." Brittany offered a weak, tight-lipped smile. She felt a small, sour knot in her stomach. Inside the closet, surrounded by boxes of sterile gauze, IV bags, and intubation kits, Sarah closed her eyes. The scent of antiseptic and cardboard was a poor substitute for the metallic tang of blood and cordite. But it was the life she had chosen. It was supposed to be peaceful. She took a deep breath, the air cool against her burning cheeks. She had survived Fallujah. She had sutured men by the light of a chemical stick in the belly of a shaking Black Hawk. She could survive Dr. Preston Sterling. She began her task, her supposedly shaky hands moving with an efficiency that would have stunned her tormentor. She didn't just check dates. She mentally catalogued inventory levels, noting what was running low, placing items used most in a crisis at the front for easy access. It wasn't alphabetical. It was tactical. An hour later, Big Mike Cogan, the night shift security guard, found her finishing up. A man mountain in his 60s with a gentle face and the past as a college football lineman, Mike made a point of knowing everyone's name and their coffee order. "That's a raw deal he gave you, Sarah," Mike said, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a closet, Mike," she replied, her own voice raspy, a remnant of years spent shouting over the noise of engines and explosions. "It ain't about the closet," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's about respect. A man like that, he doesn't respect the people doing the actual work. You watch yourself around him." "I always do," she said, giving him a small, tired smile. She slid the last box of sutures into place and closed the door. The closet was a work of art, a testament to order and readiness. No one would ever notice. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah's story, because what happened next changed everything. The rest of the week was a slow, grinding version of the same. Sterling found new and creative ways to demean her. He'd have her recheck vitals he knew were just taken, loudly questioning her hearing. He'd accidentally spill a cup of coffee near her station and ask Grandma to clean it up, for patient safety, of course. Through it all, Sarah remained a pillar of quiet deference. She did the tasks without complaint. She answered his condescending questions with professional brevity. She never raised her voice. She never broke. To Sterling, it was a sign of her weakness, of a spirit already broken. He was wrong. It was the discipline of a soldier holding a defensive position, conserving ammunition. The betting pool on her termination grew to nearly $1,000. Sterling was confident his $500 was safe. He figured he'd have her gone by the end of the month. He was off by about 3 weeks. It happened on a Friday night, under the relentless humming glare of the trauma bay's fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the usual smells of a big city ER, antiseptic, stale coffee, and the faint underlying scent of fear. The shift had been a relentless churn of drunks, domestic disputes, and a multi-car pileup on the I-5. The staff was ragged. Then the dedicated line rang. Not the regular ambulance dispatch, but the red phone, the one that connected to a military frequency. Brenda O'Brien snatched it up. "Trauma 1, O'Brien?" She listened, her face going pale. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a pasty grey mask. Her knuckles were white on the receiver. "Understood," she finally choked out, slamming the phone down. She hit the overhead alarm button. The klaxon didn't just ring, it screamed. A sound reserved for the absolute worst-case scenarios. "Code Black!" she bellowed, her voice shaking for the first time anyone could remember. "Code Black! Military casualty inbound. ETA 2 minutes. Trauma Team Alpha to the bay. This is not a drill." The atmosphere in the emergency department shifted instantly. The low-level chaos became a focused, high-tension silence. Nurses and residents moved with practiced urgency. Sterling, who had been flirting with Brittany at the nurses' station, straightened his white coat, a predatory gleam in his eyes. A Code Black was a career maker, a chance to perform under the brightest lights. "All right, people, listen up," he barked, striding to the center of the trauma bay, assuming command. "I want full sterile field, chest tubes, thoracotomy tray, and a full cross-match of O-neg on standby. I'm lead on this. Park, Reynolds, you're with me. Everyone else, stay clear unless I call for you." His eyes swept the room and landed on Sarah, who was standing quietly by a supply cart, her hands clasped behind her back. "Miller, you stay out of the way. Go check the stock in Trauma 2. We can't afford any mistakes. Before Sarah could even respond, the automatic doors to the ambulance bay burst open with a pneumatic hiss. But it wasn't a city ambulance. 2 uniformed military police officers, weapons held at a low ready, flanked a gurney that was being pushed at a dead run by a frantic team of flight medics.
"We got a Navy SEAL commander,"
one of the medics yelled, his voice strained. "Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. BP is 80/40 and dropping. We've pushed 4 units of ONEG and 2 of plasma. He's barely holding on." They slammed the gurney into place in Trauma 1. The man on the table was a ruin. His uniform was shredded and soaked in a dark, glistening crimson. Blood was everywhere. He was huge, a mountain of muscle even in his broken state, with a face chiseled from granite and now pale as marble. An oxygen mask was strapped to his face, but his breathing was shallow, rapid and raspy. Sterling was in his element. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of life-saving. "Get me suction. I need a large bore IV in that AC. Let's get these chest pads on him. I want a portable X-ray in here now. Let's find these bleeders, people." He was loud. He was decisive. He was completely focused on the dramatic, bleeding gunshot wounds in the man's torso. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began cutting away the uniform, barking orders, pointing out entry and exit wounds. He was the hero, the surgeon, the man in charge. And he was missing it. Sarah hadn't gone to Trauma 2. She stood by the wall, just outside the main scrum of bodies, her eyes not on the bloody wounds, but on the patient's neck and upper chest. She saw what Sterling, in his glorious tunnel vision, did not. The man's neck veins were distended, bulging like thick ropes against his pale skin. His trachea, the windpipe in the center of his throat, wasn't in the center at all. It was visibly shifted, pushed almost 3 centimeters to the left. And when Dr. David Park, a young resident, put a stethoscope to the right side of the patient's chest, his face went blank with confusion. "Dr. Sterling," Park said, his voice hesitant. I have no breath sounds on the right side." "It's the noise in here, Park. Use your ears," Sterling snapped, without looking up from a particularly nasty wound in the man's abdomen. "He's bleeding out, that's the problem. Get me more lap pads." The monitor above the patient's head began to shriek a new, more frantic rhythm. The oxygen saturation number was plummeting. 85. 80. 74. "His sats are dropping," Brittany cried out. "The pulse ox is faulty. It probably got wet. Get another one on him," Sterling commanded, his voice tight with irritation. He refused to believe the data that contradicted his diagnosis. The problem was the bleeding. It had to be. Sarah pushed off the wall. She took 2 steps forward. The quiet librarian was gone. Her eyes were flinty, her jaw set. "Dr. Sterling," she said, her raspy voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. He ignored her. "I need that X-ray. Where is it?" "Doctor!" Sarah's voice was sharper now. "Look at his neck." Sterling finally glanced up, his face a mask of fury. "Nurse Miller, I gave you an order. Get out of my trauma bay before I have you thrown out." "He has a tension pneumothorax," Sarah stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. "The gunshot must have punctured his lung. Air is filling his chest cavity, crushing his lung and his heart. He's not dying from blood loss, he's suffocating. You're focusing on the wrong injury." The room went deathly silent. The only sounds were the frantic, failing beeps of the monitor. Everyone stared. A nurse, an old, quiet, shaky-handed nurse, had just contradicted the chief of surgery in the middle of a code black. Sterling's face went from red to a blotchy, furious purple. His handsome features twisted into an ugly snarl. "You are finished," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. You are so far out of your lane you can't even see the lines anymore. You do not diagnose, you do not question my judgment. You are a nurse." He spat the word out like it was a curse. The O2 monitor dropped to 68. The patient's lips, visible around the edges of the oxygen mask, were turning a dusky, terrifying shade of blue. His eyes began to roll back in his head. "Brenda," Sterling barked, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Call security. I want her removed from my hospital. Now." Harold Pemberton, the hospital administrator, had scurried into the room, drawn by the code black. He was a man who sweated easily, and whose primary function was to avoid lawsuits. He saw the rage on the face of Senator Sterling's son, and made a swift, spineless calculation. "Nurse Miller," Pemberton said, wringing his hands. "You heard Dr. Sterling. Please leave the trauma bay immediately. We'll discuss your employment status later." The patient's heart rate on the monitor suddenly crashed. The steady beep devolved into a single, continuous, soul-destroying tone. Flatline. The sound shattered the standoff. For a split second, everyone was frozen. Sterling stared at the monitor, his confident facade finally cracking, revealing the sheer panic underneath. He had failed, in front of everyone. In that moment of stunned silence, Sarah Miller made a choice. Her promise to her husband to live a quiet life warred with a deeper, more primal oath she had taken long ago. To preserve life at any cost. The oath won. She moved. It wasn't the slow, shuffling gait they were used to. It was an explosion of coiled energy. She didn't run, she flowed, a blur of motion that was terrifying in its efficiency. She bypassed the scrub line, her hand darting out to snatch a 14-gauge angiocath, a long, thick needle, from an open tray. Sterling, finally jolting into action, turned back to the patient. "Get me the crash cart. Start compressions." Sarah was already there. She stepped between him and the patient's head. Sterling reached out to shove her aside. "Get away from him!" She didn't even look at him. As his hand came toward her, she dropped her shoulder and pivoted. It wasn't a push, it was a tactical block, an unyielding wall of bone and muscle that met his chest with a solid thump. The move was pure combat medicine, designed to clear a space around a patient. Sterling, all 190 pounds of him, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, a grunt of pained surprise escaping his lips. He tripped over a cord and landed hard on the floor. "He doesn't need compressions, you idiot!" Sarah's voice was no longer quiet or raspy. It was a low, guttural command, a field-stripped growl that had once made hardened soldiers snap to attention. "He needs a hole in his chest!" Ignoring the stunned gasps from everyone in the room, she was already at work. Her left hand, the one that always trembled, was now rock steady. She pressed it flat against the SEAL's massive chest, her fingers expertly finding the landmarks she could have located in her sleep. The clavicle, the sternum, the second intercostal space on the mid-clavicular line. Her right hand brought the needle up. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. She had performed this exact procedure more than 100 times. In the back of shaking helicopters, in muddy ditches, under the flickering green light of night vision. She plunged the 14-gauge needle deep into the man's chest. The sound was audible throughout the now silent room. A sharp, definitive hiss. It was the sound of trapped air, pressurized to a fatal degree, escaping the thoracic cavity. It was the sound of a lung reinflating. It was the sound of life returning. The patient on the table arched his back and took a huge, shuddering, gasping breath. The flatline tone on the monitor was instantly replaced by a steady, strong beep. The oxygen saturation number, which had been a flat 0, began to climb with breathtaking speed. 70, 75, 85, 92, 98. The dusky blue of his lips faded back to a healthy pink. His chest began to rise and fall in a beautiful, symmetrical rhythm. Sarah pulled the needle out, leaving the flexible catheter in place, and taped it down. Her work was done. She stepped back from the table, her entire body trembling now that the adrenaline was starting to recede. She leaned against a supply cart, her knees suddenly weak. The room was a frozen tableau of disbelief. Brittany Moore's hands were clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. David Park was staring at Sarah as if she had just grown a second head. Brenda O'Brien's jaw was slack, her tough veteran's mask completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Sterling scrambled to his feet, his face a mottled canvas of humiliation and rage. "You assaulted me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You're fired! You'll be arrested! Your nursing license is gone! You—" He was cut off. The Navy SEAL commander on the table, his eyes now clear and focused, lifted his head slightly. He ignored the clamoring doctor. He ignored the stunned nurses. His gaze swept the room until it found Sarah, leaning against the cart. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, locked with hers. A flicker of recognition, of profound understanding, passed between them. With a visible, agonizing effort, he raised his massive, blood-streaked right hand. He didn't wave, he didn't point. He brought it slowly, shakily, to his brow in a formal military salute. A salute of absolute, unconditional respect from one warrior to another. Through the plastic of the oxygen mask, he whispered a single word, just loud enough for the people closest to him to hear. "Dusty." The two MPs standing guard at the door, who had been watching the entire scene with grim intensity, suddenly snapped to attention, their faces rigid. The name hung in the air, an impossible, explosive revelation. Sterling stared, his mouth hanging open. "What? What the hell just happened? What did he call you?" Sarah simply met the commander's gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, Commander," she said, her voice once again quiet. "Let the doctors work." Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling. Because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. The spell was broken, but the world had been irrevocably tilted on its axis. The staff of Trauma 1 began to move again, but their movements were hesitant, their glances darting from the stabilized SEAL to the quiet nurse who had just performed a miracle and then been saluted for it. Sterling, however, was incapable of accepting this new reality. His entire world was built on a foundation of hierarchy and his own perceived superiority. That foundation had just been pulverized. "This is insane!" he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "She stabbed him! She performed an unauthorized procedure. She could have killed him! It was pure luck! Pemberton, are you going to let her get away with this? She assaulted me!" Harold Pemberton, whose face was now the color of wet cement, finally found his voice. Liability, lawsuits, assault, a fired nurse performing rogue surgery. It was a nightmare. He saw only one path forward: contain the damage, follow the chain of command, and sacrifice the nurse.
Security,
Pemberton said, his voice a reedy squeak.
Mr. Cogan, escort Nurse Miller to my office, immediately.
Big Mike Cogan stepped forward, his expression pained. He looked from Pemberton to the now revered Sarah, then back to the sputtering Dr. Sterling. For a moment, it looked as if he might refuse. But a job was a job.
"Sarah, he said softly. You have to come with me. Sarah pushed herself off the cart. She looked at the commander, who was now being attended to by a humbled and silent Dr. Park. The man's eyes followed her as she walked away, a silent promise in their depths. The walk to the administrator's office was a walk of shame, yet every nurse and orderly she passed looked at her with a newfound reverence. Whispers followed her down the hall. That's her, the one who saved the seal. Sterling is trying to get her fired. Pemberton's office was all dark mahogany and plush leather, a room designed to intimidate. Sterling was already there, pacing like a caged animal, his white coat discarded, revealing an expensive tailored suit. An HR director, a woman with a face like a closed fist, sat at the table with a file open in front of her. Sarah Miller, the HR director began, her voice devoid of emotion. You are being terminated, effective immediately, for gross insubordination, reckless endangerment, and physical assault on an attending physician. Sterling stopped pacing. And I'm pressing charges, he snarled. You will never work in a hospital again. You're a menace, a mentally unstable old woman who thinks she knows better than a Harvard-educated surgeon. Sarah stood before them, small and tired in her oversized scrubs. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just looked at Pemberton. The patient is stable, isn't he, Mr. Pemberton? She asked, her voice calm. Pemberton flinched. That's beside the point. You violated protocol. You assaulted a doctor. I see, Sarah said. She looked down at her hands, the tremor now violently visible in the aftermath of the adrenaline. I just did my job. She looked up, her gaze clear and unwavering. If saving a life costs me my career, I'll pay that price. That quiet dignity seemed to enrage Sterling even more. Get her out of here! I want her off the property! Pemberton nodded to Big Mike, who had been standing silently by the door. Mike handed Sarah a small, empty cardboard box, the universal symbol of termination. 2 decades of service in the most dangerous places on earth, a promise to a dying husband, a search for peace, all of it now reduced to a box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of her beat-up 20-year-old sedan. She walked to her locker in silence, Mike trailing behind her. She packed her things, a cracked coffee mug that said, World's Okayest Nurse, a well-worn stethoscope she'd bought with her own money, a small, dying, succulent plant, and a framed photo of her husband, a handsome young man in army dress greens. This ain't right, Sarah, Mike said again as they reached the hospital's main exit. What you did in there, that was something else. Watch that blood pressure, Mike, she said, managing a weak smile. And tell Brenda she's running low on ketamine. He nodded, his eyes misty. He swiped his card, and the automatic glass doors slid open with a final, indifferent whoosh, releasing her into the cold, miserable Seattle night. The rain was coming down in sheets, a torrential downpour that instantly plastered her greying hair to her forehead and soaked through her thin scrubs. She didn't have an umbrella. Her car, with its failing transmission she couldn't afford to fix, was 6 blocks away. She clutched the soggy cardboard box to her chest, trying to shield the photo of her husband from the relentless rain. She stood at the corner, huddled under the flimsy shelter of a bus stop, as water pooled around her worn sneakers. It was over. The thought wasn't angry or sad. It was just a heavy, suffocating fact. She was an unemployed, middle-aged woman with a mysterious gap in her resume and a termination for assault on her record. No hospital would touch her. Maybe she could be a greeter at a grocery store. The bus hissed to a stop in front of her. As she looked at her own reflection in the rain-streaked window, a tired, defeated old woman, she felt a profound and bottomless despair. He had won. The arrogant prince had won. She was wrong. It started as a low thrumming, a vibration she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it. The puddles on the street began to ripple. The glass of the bus shelter rattled in its frame. Then the sound arrived, tearing through the drone of the city and the drumming of the rain. Thwop, thwop, thwop. It was a sound she knew in her bones, the sound of heavy rotors beating the air into submission. She looked up. Through a tear in the low grey clouds, she saw them. 2 of them. MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, painted a flat, non-reflective black, the kind used by special operations. They weren't heading for the hospital's helipad. They were descending, impossibly, toward the street. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. Cars slammed on their brakes, their tires screeching on the wet pavement, causing a chain reaction pileup. One of the Blackhawks, with a precision that defied belief, landed directly in the middle of the intersection a block away, its downdraft powerful enough to invert umbrellas and send trash cans rolling down the street. The air pressure changed, making Sarah's ears pop. Simultaneously, the street was flooded with black SUVs, their red and blue lights washing the entire scene in a blinding, frantic pulse. They screeched to a halt, positioning themselves sideways to block all traffic. Men in dark suits and earpieces, Secret Service, poured out of some, while soldiers in full combat gear, rifles at the ready, deployed from others. The scene was one of overwhelming, terrifying federal power. Sarah just stood there, clutching her box, a forgotten figure in the midst of a maelstrom. A soldier, scanning the panicked crowd with tactical precision, suddenly stopped. He raised a hand and pointed directly at the bus shelter. "Target located!" His voice crackled over a radio. "In the rear, by the bus!" Another soldier, young and athletic, broke from the line and sprinted through the gridlocked traffic, dodging stalled cars and panicked civilians. He ran with the fluid grace of a man who had done it 1,000 times under far more dangerous conditions. He reached her, his chest heaving, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. "Ma'am?" he gasped, his eyes wide with a desperate urgency. "Are you Sarah Miller?" Sarah nodded, speechless. "Ma'am, you need to come with us, right now." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip firm but respectful. "The general is waiting." Before she could process what was happening, the rear door of the lead black SUV swung open. A figure emerged, stepping out into the pouring rain as if it didn't dare touch him. He was older, in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and a face etched with the gravity of command. He leaned on a simple wooden cane, but he didn't use it for support. He wielded it like a scepter. On the shoulders of his immaculate army service uniform, 4 silver stars gleamed even in the gloomy twilight. General Thomas Vance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, walked directly toward the bus stop. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes, which had seen the best and worst of humanity, crinkling at the corners. "You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty," he said, his voice a calm, powerful baritone that carried easily over the chaos. Sarah stared at him, the cardboard box slipping from her numb fingers and landing with a wet slap on the pavement. The framed photo of her husband fell out, face up in a puddle. "General Vance," she whispered, the name a ghost from another lifetime. "Tom?" "You look like hell, Sarah," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He bent down with some difficulty and picked up the photo, wiping the rain from the glass with his thumb. He looked at the young soldier in the picture, then back at her. "He'd be proud of you. He always was." What is happening?" she stammered. "Commander Phillips is my godson," Vance said, his expression hardening. "I was on a secure video call with the president when the code black was activated. We saw the whole thing on the hospital's security feed." He gestured back toward the hospital. "They told me you were fired. That ends now. Get in the car, Colonel. We have a record to correct." The young soldier picked up her soggy box. "Drop the box, ma'am. We're going," he started to say. "No," Sarah said, her voice finding its strength. "The box comes with me." Back at Harbour View, Dr. Preston Sterling was holding court in the main lobby. News crews, drawn by the spectacle of the military arrival, had materialized. Sterling, having changed into a fresh, crisp white coat, stood before a bank of microphones, his composure restored, his arrogant smile firmly back in place. "It was a tense situation," he was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "The patient presented with multiple traumatic injuries, and my team and I had to work quickly to stabilize him. There was a minor complication, a pneumothorax, which I was able to identify and resolve immediately with a needle decompression. The patient is stable and resting comfortably, thanks to the swift and decisive action of my surgical team." He was taking full credit, erasing her from the story entirely. "There were reports of a nurse being fired during the incident," a reporter shouted. Sterling's smile tightened. "An unfortunate situation. We had a nurse on staff who appeared to be unstable. She became hysterical and attempted to interfere with the procedure, even assaulting me at one point. For the safety of the patient, I had her removed. Her employment has been terminated. This hospital has no tolerance for staff who put their egos ahead of patient care." It was at that exact moment that the main entrance doors burst open. General Vance strode in, flanked by 2 Secret Service agents and the 2 MPs from the trauma bay. Sarah followed a pace behind him, clutching her pathetic cardboard box, dripping water all over the polished marble floor. The lobby fell silent. Cameras swiveled. Sterling froze mid-sentence, his face draining of all color. General Vance didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the podium, his 4-star glare pinning Sterling in place. "Dr. Sterling," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I was just watching your press conference. It seems you've omitted a few key details. It's time to correct the record." Vance held up a military-grade tablet, the screen showing the crystal-clear security footage from Trauma 1. He turned it so the cameras could see. "This footage, along with the patient's real-time telemetry data, has already been reviewed by the President of the United States." Sterling began to sweat, his eyes darting around for an escape, for his father's influence, for anything. There was nothing. "You just told the nation that you saved my godson's life," Vance continued, his voice like chips of ice. "You lied. First-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax. You were so focused on the blood, so focused on playing the hero, you almost let him die." He gestured to Sarah, who stood there, small and soaked, the box in her hands. "Do you have any idea who this unstable nurse is?" Vance asked the silent, captivated room. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled a thin black folder from inside his coat, a folder stamped with "Classified" in red letters. "This," he said, tapping the folder, "is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller, retired, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment and Joint Special Operations Command. She served 3 tours in Iraq and 4 in Afghanistan. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and a Bronze Star with Valor for, among other things, performing a field cricothyrotomy under heavy enemy fire." A collective gasp went through the room. Brittany Moore, standing in the back, felt tears welling in her eyes. Brenda O'Brien just stared, her face a mask of awe. "They call her Dusty because she was legendary for being the last one on the bird, refusing to leave the wounded until every last one was accounted for, even if it meant walking through a dust-off thick with enemy fire." Vance's voice boomed. "Her hands shake. That's not nerves, doctor. That's permanent nerve damage she sustained while holding direct pressure on my artery for 6 hours in a ditch in Kandahar, saving my life when I was a young captain." She refused morphine and evacuation until I was safe. He took a step closer to Sterling, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure terror. When this woman, this hero, attempted to save a life today, you didn't listen. You assaulted her, you fired her. By order of the President of the United States, Colonel Miller's retirement is hereby revoked. She is being reactivated to active duty, at her former rank and pay, to oversee the complete overhaul of this hospital's trauma training protocols. Vance then turned his gaze to the sweating, trembling Harold Pemberton. And you, Dr. Sterling, are the subject of a federal investigation for filing a false report, reckless endangerment, and lying to federal officials. I suggest you start updating your resume, assuming you're allowed to practice medicine ever again. Pemberton, seeing his entire career about to go up in flames, acted with the swiftness of a cornered rat. He pulled a pre-written letter from his jacket pocket, Sterling's termination notice, likely prepared for just such a political emergency.
Dr. Sterling, Pemberton stammered. Effective immediately, your privileges at Harbor View are suspended, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The board has voted to terminate your contract. Sterling just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. His power, his name, his connections, all of it had just evaporated under the heat of 4 silver stars. Then, in the most perfect moment of karmic justice, Big Mike Cogan stepped forward from the crowd. He was holding a new, empty cardboard box. He walked right up to the disgraced surgeon and held it out. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Mike said, his voice flat and heavy with satisfaction. He paused, leaning in so only Sterling could hear. Should have respected the nurses. Sterling stared at the box, then at the cameras flashing in his face, then at the woman he had tried to destroy. Sarah simply watched him, her expression not triumphant, but weary. The war was finally over. He stumbled away from the podium, a broken man, and walked toward his office, the empty box in his hands, to pack up the remnants of his shattered career. General Vance turned to Sarah. He gently took the soggy box from her hands and passed it to the young soldier. "Welcome back, Colonel," he said softly. He offered her his arm. "Now, let's go see about getting you a dry uniform." 1 year later, the sun, a rare and welcome visitor in Seattle, streamed through the large windows of the newly dedicated Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Pediatric and Combat Trauma. The hospital wing wasn't just renamed, it had been reborn. Sarah, now in a crisp, tailored suit, stood at a podium. She wasn't the director. She had turned down the fancy administrative titles. She had accepted one position: Chief of Trauma Training Protocols. She didn't want to manage budgets. She wanted to teach, to empower, to ensure that no nurse ever again had to choose between their career and a patient's life. In the front row, General Vance sat smiling, his cane resting against his chair. Beside him sat a healthy, vibrant Commander Phillips, a faint scar on his chest, the only reminder of his brush with death. The new Chief of Surgery, a humble and deeply respectful woman, watched Sarah with admiration. The hospital staff, from Brenda and Brittany to the janitors and security guards, stood tall, the culture of fear replaced by one of mutual respect. Sarah's protocols, which emphasized teamwork and empowered nurses to halt a procedure if they perceived a critical danger, were already being adopted by hospitals nationwide. They called it the Miller Mandate. After her short speech, a young nurse, barely out of school, approached her nervously. "Colonel Miller, ma'am, what if I'm not sure? What if I make the wrong call?" Sarah looked at the young woman's earnest, worried face and saw a reflection of a much younger version of herself. She put a hand on the nurse's shoulder. Her hand was still not perfectly steady, but its touch was firm and reassuring. "Your only job is to protect your patient," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "You trust your gut.
you speak up. And if they don't listen, you speak louder. If you have to break a rule to save a life, you do it. She smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up her entire face. Don't worry, I'll have your back. As for Dr. Preston Sterling, his medical license was permanently revoked. His father, the senator, facing a massive political scandal, chose not to run for re-election. The last anyone heard, Sterling was managing a fast food franchise in Ohio, his name tag crooked on his shirt, forever checking expiration dates on mayonnaise packets, his once steady hands now shaking with a tremor all their own. And that is how Sarah Miller went from fired and humiliated to a national hero in less than an hour. The story of Sarah Miller is a reminder that true heroism often goes unnoticed until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary. In a world obsessed with titles, status, and bureaucracy, it's easy to forget that the most important people in the room are often the ones doing the actual work. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible stories of justice. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. Never judge a book by its cover, and never, ever underestimate a nurse. Comment below with your thoughts on Dr. Sterling's fate.
Thanks for watching.